Wyatt Ledbetter cinched the saddle too slow for a man who was only riding out to collect a prisoner. Slow like a man afraid his own body would betray him in front of others. The strap passed through the buckle, tightened, eased a finger's width, tightened again. The stable still smelled of hay gone damp from the night's rain, and outside, Llano County was waking up slow. A rooster, a bucket clanging, the first smoke rising from some distant chimney. Behind him, leaned against the stable wood, the cane waited where he'd left it, close enough to reach quick, far enough that nobody would notice he needed it. He didn't look at it. That alone was already a lie. 18 months. That was how long it took his leg to accept this. A posse bullet doesn't heal the same as a war bullet. The war one comes with an excuse. This one only comes with shame. 18 months of an empty saddle in the corral, of folks around Llano County asking too carefully how he was doing, of Sheriff Farrow inventing light duty for a man who never asked for light duty. Today was different. The first real warrant they'd handed him back. Cattle theft. Simple. A woman, a herd, a judge's signature. The kind of work that proves a ranger still serves some purpose. He mounted without asking the cane for help, used the halter, the stirrup, his own weight, thrown too fast toward the good side. And for 1 second, the world spun. He held the rein until it stopped spinning. Nobody saw. That was how he counted it, in his own head. He rode through the Llano Square still empty, the limestone jail newly built with its windows dark, the land office shut till 8. A dog barked once and gave up. It was that kind of morning. The whole county still deciding whether it was worth waking up all the way. Wyatt greeted no one, because there was no one to greet, and rode on downriver along the trail he knew by heart. Badu's crossing sat an hour's ride downriver. Dawn still hung in that gray that hasn't decided if it's turning into day yet. Fog rose off the low water like smoke from a fire gone out not long before. Wyatt had known that crossing since he was a boy. A generation of cattle crossing for Kansas. A generation of troops crossing for war. Now him, crossing to arrest a woman who maybe didn't even know she was being hunted. The horse stepped sure on the limestone trail. With every step, the pain climbed the leg and settled back down. A tide he'd learned to notice without reacting to. The river, further down, made that low sound of water in no hurry. A hawk cut across the gray overhead, vanished behind a wall of rock. Wyatt liked this hour of day. The only one when the Texas hill country still seemed to belong only to whoever had the nerve to be awake to see it. The folded paper in his coat pocket said this: Kaya, Apache, accused of stealing cattle belonging to Amos Trewin. Wyatt had read her name twice. The lease itself, not once. Checking took work, and work was exactly what he wanted to be doing again. Not questioning, doing. He'd signed under the warrant the way he signed all of them, trusting that somebody before him had already checked for him. The horse picked its way down the bank careful, hooves sinking into wet sand, and that was when Wyatt saw her. She stood in the shallow water, knee-deep, a loose rope in her hand, tied to a dozen head of cattle grazing free on the far bank. Cattle that didn't run, long used to that owner. Her skirt, wet to the middle, had the hem pulled toward the same side, a weight there that didn't match the rest of the cloth. He registered it without understanding why, the way a man registers a crooked nail in a good plank. She didn't startle, didn't run into the fog, didn't shout for the herd to scatter, didn't do any of the things Wyatt had seen people do when a badge shows up at dawn. Just stood where she was, water around her legs, watching him come down the bank like someone expecting a visit long since scheduled, like she already knew, before he himself knew it clearly, the exact reason for that ride. The cattle kept grazing behind her, indifferent. Their coats, wet with dew, caught what little sun already broke through the fog. Not one skittish animal, no sign of a recent theft. Stolen cattle run, push, smell the fear of whoever took them. That herd just chewed grass the way it had always chewed there. Wyatt registered that too, and didn't know why either. Wyatt stopped his horse at the edge of the crossing. The cane, back there, leaned against the stable wood, kept waiting, and for one instant, only one, he felt he'd left behind more than a piece of wood. The woman in the water raised her chin an inch, no more, and waited for him to speak first. Wyatt did not oblige her right away. He let the horse stand, let the water keep moving around her knees, let the fog burn another few seconds off the far bank. It was a habit from the war, and before that from his father. Never be the first voice in a room you didn't build. He'd relearned it these 18 months. The same way he'd relearned to mount without asking help. Kaya, he said finally, just the name. He'd practiced saying it right on the ride down, so it wouldn't come out clumsy in front of her. That's the first time a lawman said it and not asked how to spell it. Her voice was even, not proud, not afraid, just even like water finding the only level it had. He held up the folded paper more from habit than need. She wasn't going to run. Some part of him already understood that. Warrant says you took cattle belonging to Amos Trewin, 12 head. Says it plain. Then it says plain. She didn't argue the point, didn't raise her voice. She looked past him once at the herd grazing behind her, unbothered, chewing the wet grass like they'd chewed it every morning of their lives. Then she looked back at Wyatt, said nothing else about the cattle at all. That should have told him something. It didn't, not yet. I'm going to need you to come with me to Llano, he said. Judge'll hear it proper when he rides through. How long is proper? Wyatt didn't have a good answer, and he didn't pretend to. 6 weeks, maybe less. She nodded once, like she'd already done the arithmetic on that number before he finished saying it. Then she waded toward the bank, slow, the water dragging at the hem of her skirt. Wyatt saw again that strange pull at the seam, heavier on one side than the cloth should carry. He filed it away the same place he'd filed it the first time, a crooked nail. Not his business yet. She didn't fight the rope when he offered it, didn't flinch from his hands when he helped her onto the second horse, an old gray mare he'd brought along for exactly this. Her wrists stayed loose in the tie. He hadn't pulled it tight, and she hadn't asked him to. You always this quiet with a horse thief? She asked once they'd started up the bank. Only met one before, Wyatt said. He cried the whole ride in. You're not doing that. I already cried what I had, Kaya said. Years ago, for someone else. He didn't ask who. A ranger learned early which doors a stranger opens on purpose and which ones swing open by accident. This one had swung open by accident. Wyatt let it swing shut again without putting his boot in it. He told himself that was mercy. Some of it was. Some of it was just a man not ready yet to hear an answer he couldn't do anything about. The cattle stayed behind at the crossing. 12 head bunched loose under the watch of a boy Wyatt had hired at the livery for the day. Trewin's hands would collect them by afternoon. The warrant said so. And warrants said things plain. They rode the hour back to Llano, mostly without talking. The fog burned off the hill country slow, the way it always did. Somewhere past the second ridge, the sun found the top of Wyatt's hat and stayed there. Warm, ordinary, a Tuesday sun that didn't know it was riding over anything more than a routine arrest. Kaya sat the gray mare straight back the whole way, watching the country go by like she was memorizing it or saying goodbye to it. Wyatt couldn't yet tell which. The county jail stood at the edge of the square, limestone still pale from the quarry, mortar not yet gone gray with weather, new enough that the iron on the cell door still swung without a groan. Sheriff Declan Farrow met them in the yard, thumbs in his belt, squinting up at the two riders with the particular boredom of a man who'd been awake since 4 and intended everyone to know it. "That her?" Farrow said, like there might have been some doubt. "That's her." Wyatt swung down careful, favoring the leg, and this time he let Farrow see him do it, too tired to hide it or too sure of the morning's work to care. He helped Kaya down himself. She didn't need the help. She let her hand rest in his only as long as the dismount required, then took it back the moment her boots found ground. The exact weight of trust owed to a stranger, no more. Farrow walked her back to the cell block without another word to her. Wyatt followed, because the paperwork wasn't finished and because some smaller reason he didn't examine too closely. The cell was cool, stone cool, the kind of cool that felt clean in July and would feel like something else entirely once the nights turned. Kaya stepped inside without being told twice. She sat on the cot, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at neither man. Farrow swung the door shut. The iron caught with a sound still too new to be a groan, more a click, precise, like a good lock closing on a good box. He turned the key, tested it once, glanced back at Wyatt with the flat, unbothered look of a man passing along gossip he didn't think mattered. "Funny thing," Farrow said, already walking off toward the front office. "Ain't the first one of that family we've locked up in this county." Wyatt stood there with his hand still resting on the cold iron bar. "What family?" he said. But Farrow was already gone, boots echoing down the stone hall. The only answer left in the room was Kaya, silent on the cot, and the sound of water somewhere far off, still moving through the Badu crossing, without either of them in it. Farrow never did say what family. 3 days passed, and the question sat in Wyatt the way a splinter sits under a nail, small and impossible to forget for more than an hour at a time. He asked Farrow again, once, over coffee. Farrow just shrugged, said he must have been thinking of some other case, and poured himself a second cup. Wyatt let it go. A man learns which doors in Llano open easy and which ones don't open at all. That one didn't. The leg made the decision for him anyway. Doc Pruitt looked at it, pressed 2 fingers into the muscle until Wyatt's jaw tightened, and said the word overworked like it was a diagnosis and a scolding both. Sheriff Farrow didn't need telling twice. Night watch at the jail, sit in a chair, mind the cell block, wake the dayman if anything needed minding. Light work, the kind of work a county gives a ranger it doesn't quite know what to do with yet. Wyatt hated it for exactly 1 night. By the second, he'd stopped hating it. By the third, he noticed something he wished he hadn't. She counted, not out loud. He had to sit very still to catch it at all. Chair tipped back against the stone wall, lamp turned low to save the oil. A breath in, a number barely voiced, more shape of the mouth than sound. A breath out, another number. She did it lying on the cot with her eyes closed, hands folded on her stomach like a woman at her own wake. And she did it slow enough that Wyatt found himself counting along without meaning to, just to see how far she'd go before she lost the thread. She never lost the thread. "You always do that?" he asked the third night, because the silence had gotten too big for the room. She opened her eyes, didn't sit up. Do what? Count. A pause, long enough that Wyatt thought she wouldn't answer at all. "Helps me know how much of the night's left," she said finally. "Helps more than staring at the ceiling." It was a reasonable answer. He almost believed it. Almost. Except that it came out too even. No catch anywhere in it. The way truth usually snags on something before it clears a person's throat. He filed that away next to the pull in her skirtum, the two odd threads of a woman he was starting to realize he'd arrested without ever once wondering who she was. He brought her water that night. Not required, not forbidden either. Farrow wouldn't have cared either way. Farrow barely looked at the cell block once his boots hit the front porch. "Obliged," Kaya said, and drank half of it slow, like she was rationing that too. The fourth night, boredom did what 3 days of instinct hadn't. It made him actually read the warrant, not skim it. Read it. 12 head of cattle, the paper said, taken from land belonging to Amos Trewin, filed and sworn the week prior. Wyatt had ridden past Trewin's spread a dozen times over the years. Small outfit, 40 head, maybe 50 on a good season, run by Trewin and one hired hand who mostly just complained about the heat. A man with 50 head didn't need 12 more grazing a crossing 3 miles from his own fence line. Didn't need it, and Wyatt sat with this part longer, hadn't so much as ridden out to look at the cattle himself before swearing out the warrant. Wyatt had checked the herd himself the morning of the arrest, without knowing he was checking anything. No brand scars from a hasty remarking, no skittishness, no herd memory of a stranger's rope, just an animal that grazed like it always had, where it always had. He didn't say any of this to Kaya, wasn't ready to. A man doesn't hand a prisoner a doubt he hasn't finished building yet. But he watched her differently after that. Watched the way she sat, spine straight, even on a cot built for slouching, hands still even when her breathing wasn't. Watched the hem of her skirt, dried stiff now from the crossing, still pulled the same stubborn direction it had pulled wet. He'd told himself it was a crooked seam. He was starting to suspect it was something heavier than thread. The fifth night, Farrow came by later than usual, smelling of the saloon, and leaned against the bars long enough to look Kaya over like livestock at auction. "Counting again?" he said. Not unkind exactly, just the tone a man saves for something he's already decided doesn't matter. "Heard you doing it clear from the office." Kaya didn't answer him. Didn't look at him either. Farrow laughed once, short, and wandered back toward the front room, keys jangling loose on his belt like a man who'd already forgotten he'd spoken at all. Wyatt waited until the office door swung shut. "Why do you count?" he asked again. Quieter this time, no lawman in it at all. Just a man in a chair, past midnight, asking a question because he needed the true answer more than he needed the polite one. Kaya was quiet long enough that he thought she'd let the silence answer for her, the way she'd let it answer Farrow. "To know how much I've got left," she said. "Left of what?" She turned her head on the thin pillow, looked at him for the first time that night, not unkind, not afraid, just tired in a way that went deeper than the hour. "Time," she said, and closed her eyes again, and did not say time to what. She did not say time to what, and Wyatt did not ask again that night. But the question stayed in the chair with him. It sat like the splinter had sat under the nail 3 days running. He waited out the lamp until it burned low. The stone gave up the day's last heat. Somewhere past that, he understood he wasn't going to sleep on it either. The 6th night, she talked first. He hadn't asked anything, hadn't even pulled the chair close, just sat where he always sat, boots stretched toward the bars, hat off. A man didn't need a hat to guard an empty hallway. Kaya lay on the cot with her eyes on the ceiling. After a long while, her voice came out low, almost like she was telling it to the stone instead of to him. "I had a husband," she said, 5 years gone now." Wyatt didn't move, didn't want to spook the words back wherever they come from. "Posse rode through at dusk," she went on. "Said they were chasing cattle thieves off toward the breaks. He went out to see whose fire it was, because a man does that on his own land. They said after it was a mistake. Dark, and a rifle looks like a rifle in the dark." She said it flat, worn perfectly smooth, a stone carried in a pocket so long it stopped having edges at all. Mistake, that was the word in the report. I read it myself later. One word for a whole life. "I'm sorry," Wyatt said, and meant it, and knew already it wasn't worth much to her. "You don't have to be sorry. You weren't there." She turned her head, finally looked at him with something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite blame either, just a woman deciding in real time whether this ranger was worth the rest of the story. "My father was, though, not at the posse, before it, long before you were old enough to wear that badge." "Before me how?" 1861. She said the year like it was a name she'd carried her whole life. He rode 2 days to the land office to put his mark on a paper. "Grazing rights, proper and signed, for the crossing where you found me." Bureau man himself put the seal on it. My father used to say that seal was the only thing in his life that ever made a white man's word mean something. A small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He believed that a long time. Wyatt thought of the warrant folded in his coat. The name, Trewin. 12 head of cattle that didn't run scared. He didn't say any of it yet. Wasn't sure yet what he had. "Your father still living?" he asked instead. "No." Flat, same as mistake, had been a fact stated once and set down. "But the paper is." She didn't say where. Wyatt didn't ask. Not that night. Some part of him had already started adding it up on its own. The sky going a color he didn't like, long before he was ready to call it a storm out loud. She shifted on the cot, knees drawn up under the skirt. That was when he saw it again. The hem, dried stiff now, still pulling hard toward the same seam, like the cloth carried something it didn't want to admit to. He'd told himself twice already it was a crooked stitch. He was long past believing that. "You favor that side," he said, nodding at it before he could stop himself. "Every night. Same side." Kaya's hand went still on her knee, just for a second, the kind of stillness that answers a question louder than words would. Then she smoothed the skirt back down, unhurried, like a woman correcting a small thing that didn't matter. "Old habit," she said. "Sitting wears a hem crooked faster on one side than the other." It was almost a good answer. Wyatt had heard almost good answers before. from men swearing to warrants they'd never read. He let this one lie where she'd said it. Same as the counting, same as time to what? Another crooked nail in a plank he was starting to suspect was rotten clean through. He didn't press. Whatever she carried in that seam, she'd carry it at her own pace. He'd learned that much about her in 6 nights. What he hadn't learned, what neither of them saw coming that night, was how little time was left for her own pace to matter. It started as nothing, a flush high on her cheeks. Wyatt took it for lamplight at first, a stillness he mistook for calm rather than cost. She drew the thin blanket up higher than before, though the stone held its cool, the same as always. When she spoke again, her voice had gone thinner at the edges, like a thread pulled one too many times. "Cold in here tonight," she said, and Wyatt felt the wrongness of it before he could name why. The cell hadn't changed, only she had. He crossed to the bars anyway, pressed the back of his hand near enough to feel her breath, and found it warmer than the July night had any right to explain. By the time Farrow came through at sunup, boots loud and cheerful, Kaya had gone quiet in a different way, eyes half shut, breath shallow. The counting she'd done every night now nowhere to be heard at all. "She took a fever," Wyatt said. Not a question. Farrow leaned in, gave her the same passing glance he gave the woodpile each morning to see if it needed splitting. "Cell's always cold this time of year. Ain't but a chill." He said it easy, already turning for the front office and his coffee. "Woman like that's tougher than she looks. Seen worse, shake off a chill in a day or two." Wyatt looked back through the bars at the flush climbing her throat, at the blanket pulled to her chin, though the morning was already warm outside those walls, and said nothing more to Farrow at all. But he did not believe, not for 1 second, that it was only a chill. It was only a chill for 2 more days. Doc Pruitt came the second morning and said the word fever, the same flat way he'd said overworked about Wyatt's leg. A diagnosis with no particular urgency attached. He left willow bark powder and was gone before the coffee cooled. Farrow forgot the instructions before he reached the front office. Wyatt didn't forget. He brought his own blanket the 3rd night, folded it through the bars himself. Kaya didn't thank him. She was past thanking anyone for much of anything by then, her words coming slower, spaced further apart, like a woman rationing those too. She stopped counting her breaths on the 4th night. Wyatt noticed the silence before he noticed why it frightened him. The numbers had been a clock, and a clock had stopped. Kaya. She turned her head toward his voice, slow, the motion costing her something. Her eyes found him through the bars, bright with the fever now. Too bright, the kind of shine Wyatt had seen twice before in his life. Both times, a man had died within the week of it. "Still here," she said. It came out thin, almost amused in a way that had nothing left to be amused about. "Doc's coming back at first light. Doc's already told you what he's going to tell you." She wasn't arguing. She was simply further along than Wyatt wanted her to be. They both knew it. Neither one said the word that belonged in the space between them. She shifted on the cot. The motion pulled a sound out of her that wasn't a word. Pain, plain, quickly swallowed. Her hand went to her side, out of old habit. Fingers finding the hem of her skirt, pulled crooked every night since the crossing. Wyatt had stopped believing it was thread 3 nights ago. He'd never once asked outright. "Wyatt." His name. from her. For the first time, not ranger, not lawman. His name, said the way a person says a name they intend to use only once to make sure it counts. I'm here. Come closer. Won't carry far tonight. Her voice had gone to something just above breath. Not weakness, performed for sympathy, but arithmetics. The same she'd been doing every night since the sale. Only now the number had gotten too small to shout across a room. He pulled the chair to the bars until the iron pressed cold against his knee, leaned his head near enough to catch her words before the stone could steal them. The hem, she said. Pull the thread, the one that never sat right. His hand found the bunched cloth through the bars. It took him a moment, fingers clumsy with the task, a ranger's hands, built for rope and rein, not needlework. He found the loose end she meant and drew it. The stitching gave all at once, a whole season of careful sewing undone in a single pull, and something slid free into his palm. Not a coin, not a blade. A small, hard square of paper, refolded so many years running that it no longer had corners left to catch on anything. Just a worn, rounded weight, warm from riding against her skin, the way a coin goes smooth from being carried and never spent. "Read it," she said, out loud. "I want to hear it said once before." She didn't finish that sentence. Didn't need to. Wyatt unfolded it by lamplight, careful as a man handling something that might not survive a second unfolding. The hand that had written it was old, formal, the practiced copperplate of a government clerk from another decade entirely. A grazing lease, dated 1861. It granted to one man, Kaya's father's name, written plain, no title needed, full and continuing right to graze cattle upon the lands bordering the crossing at Badu, recorded and sealed by the regional agent of the Bureau. "Your father's name," Wyatt said, half to himself. "Read the rest." He turned the paper toward the lamp. Below the original grant ran a second block of text in a different hand entirely. Newer ink, sharper strokes, the confident scrawl of a man who never once imagined anyone would read his amendment aloud in a jail cell 14 months later. An addendum dated 1876, signed Osgood Prater, Agent Regional Office. It redefined the grazing right above it, quietly, in the bloodless language of a clerk closing out his morning's paperwork, as a lease subject to renewal and reassignment at the discretion of the district agent, where continued occupancy cannot be demonstrated by the original grantee. Below that, a second grant. The same crossing, the same grass, reassigned 14 months prior to one Amos Trewin. Wyatt read it twice before the shape of it fully closed around him. The land had never left her family. It had been signed away from them on paper in a room 3 days' ride from Llano by a man who never once rode out to see whose fire burned at the crossing before he wrote his name beneath somebody else's. The cattle he'd arrested her for stealing had been grazing their own grass. The 12 head weren't stolen from Trewin's land. They were Trewin's claim, standing on Kaya's. "This is why they call it a crossing," Kaya said, watching his face instead of the paper now, "because everyone thinks it belongs to whoever's standing on it that day." Wyatt sat with the 2 documents catching lamplight in his hand, the old grant and the new theft stapled together by a single dishonest sentence, and understood for the first time exactly what he had signed his own name beneath at sunrise on the day he rode to Badu. 14 months, he said, before I ever rode out there. You didn't write it, Kaya said. Not forgiveness, just fact offered the way she offered everything now, plain and running short of time to offer it any other way. You just didn't read far enough to see whose name was under it. Wyatt looked up from the paper. The fever had climbed while he wasn't watching it. Her breath had gone shallow in the time it took him to read 2 paragraphs, and the hand that had guided his fingers to the thread now lay open and still against the blanket, palm up, empty of the one thing it had carried across 5 years and 1 arrest. I have the herd count, Wyatt said, already reaching for something to hold on to that wasn't the sound of her breathing. I checked it myself. No hasty branding, no herd memory of a stranger's rope. It was always your Wyatt, he stopped. Don't tell me what I already know, she said, and for the first time in 6 nights, something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved through the fever-bright eyes. Tell the judge. Tell the judge. The words stayed with Wyatt longer than the fever did that night. Doc Pruitt came at first light, pressed 2 fingers to Kaya's wrist, said nothing at all, which frightened Wyatt more than any word Pruitt could have chosen. He left more willow bark, did not meet Wyatt's eyes on the way out. Wyatt rode to the land office before it opened. He stood on the porch with the folded lease in his coat, the same coat he'd worn to Badu 9 days before, waited for the clerk to come squinting up the street with his ring of keys. The morning was already warm. Somewhere behind him, the county went on being a county, a wagon creaking past, a dog deciding whether the day was worth barking at. Wyatt noticed none of it. He had read the lease 4 times since Kaya pressed it into his hand. Each time, the shape of it closed tighter around him, like a knot that only pulls harder the more a man worries it. The clerk's name was Vance, young, ink-stained, the kind of man who filed papers for a living and had never once expected one of them to matter. He unlocked the door, blinked at Wyatt standing there before 8, and led him back through shelves of bound ledgers that smelled of dust and tallow. 1861, Wyatt said, grazing Grant, crossing at Badu. Vance found it faster than Wyatt expected, not because the clerk cared, but because the ledger was thin that far back, half the county still unclaimed on paper in those years. He laid the register open on the counter and turned it so Wyatt could read. The entry matched, word for word. Same name, same crossing, same seal pressed into wax gone brittle with age. Wyatt set Kaya's folded copy beside it and traced both documents with his finger, line by line, slow. A man checking a debt twice because he already suspects the sum and still needs to see it written before he'll believe it. They matched all the way down. Then, in a second hand, they matched the addendum too. 1876. Osgood Prater's signature closing out a decade in a single dry sentence, reassigning the same grass to a man 3 days' ride from anyone who might ask him why. That's a county record, Vance said, some caution creeping into his voice now, watching Wyatt's face rather than the page. You want to tell me why a ranger's reading it like it bit him? Because it did, Wyatt said, and did not explain further, and rode for Trewin's spread before the clerk could ask him to. Amos Trewin was mending fence when Wyatt found him. Coat off, sleeves rolled, a man doing honest work in the honest heat of a Tuesday. 40 head of cattle grazed behind him, maybe 50. Wyatt had counted them himself once without knowing why he was counting. Ranger! Trewin straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers. "Heard you got my cattle back for me. Obliged." "They were never yours to lose," Wyatt said. Something crossed Trewin's face. Not guilt, Wyatt thought. Confusion first. Guilt came after, slower, once a man understands what he's being accused of. "I paid the lease," Trewin said. "Paid it fair to the agent's office, same as any man leases county grass. Man showed me the paper himself. Said the crossing was open, said the old claim had lapsed." He spread his hands, a gesture Wyatt recognized because he'd made it himself 9 days ago, signing a warrant he hadn't read past the first line. "I never rode out there to check whose fire was burning at that crossing before I signed. Why would I? Man in an office told me it was clear. It wasn't. I'm hearing that now." Trewin sat down hard on the fence rail, the fight gone out of him faster than Wyatt expected. "You're telling me I built a herd on a dead man's paper?" "Not dead," Wyatt said. "Reassigned. There's a difference, and it cost somebody dear." Trewin didn't argue. That, more than anything, told Wyatt what kind of man he was dealing with. Not a thief, not a liar. Just another signature under somebody else's sentence, same as Wyatt's own. The two of them stood in the heat a while, neither one saying much. Two men discovering they'd both trusted a piece of paper further than it deserved to be trusted. "She's in my jail," Wyatt said finally. "Dying of a fever she caught in a cell I put her in, over cattle that were hers to begin with." Trewin went pale under the sunburn. "I didn't know that part." "Neither did I," Wyatt said. "That's the whole trouble with a signature. It doesn't ask you what you know." He rode back to Llano with the sun behind him now, the lease folded flat against his chest where the warrant used to ride, and thought, not for the first time, but for the first time without flinching from it, of the way Kaya had said it. The law doesn't always err loudly. Sometimes it just signs quietly and hopes nobody reads it. He hadn't fully understood the sentence when she'd said it, fever climbing in her voice. He understood it now. Standing in a dead man's grazing rights with a live woman running out of hours behind stone, he'd helped lock her in. He brought his own coat to the cell that evening, laid it over the thin blanket without a word. Kaya didn't wake to thank him. Her breathing had changed sometime that afternoon. Faster, shallower, a rhythm Wyatt didn't like the sound of. He found Doc Pruitt at the saloon, nursing a slow beer, and asked him plain to come look at her again. "Saw her yesterday," Pruitt said. "See her today." Farrow was the one who stopped that from happening quick. Found Wyatt in the yard an hour later, thumbs in his belt, unhurried as always. "Doc's got paying patience, Ledbetter. County ain't spending good money keeping a prisoner comfortable. She's tougher than she looks. She's not tough. She's dying." "She's a prisoner with a chill," Farrow said, and walked off toward his supper, and did not hear, or did not care to hear, the difference between the two words. By the time Pruitt finally came, lantern in hand, the sun long down and Farrow already asleep in the front room, the fever had climbed somewhere past willow bark and rationed water. Pruitt knelt by the cot, pressed his palm flat to Kaya's forehead, then her throat, then the skin along her side where the old ache from the crossing still lived under the ribs. He didn't say chill this time. He looked up at Wyatt across the bars, and for the first time since Wyatt had known him, Doc Pruitt looked like a man who understood he'd waited a day too long to matter. "Get me hot water," he said, "and somebody better go wake the sheriff. This has gone past anything I can lance with a blade and a prayer. Hot water came slower than a dying woman's hour should have to wait on. Pruitt worked by lantern light. Cloths wrung and pressed to her throat, her wrists, the crook of her elbows. Kaya didn't fight them, didn't fight anymore. She'd stopped spending strength on anything the outcome couldn't use. Infection, Pruitt said quietly. Not to Wyatt exactly, more to the room, the way a man confesses to a church he no longer expects to answer. Started in the side, building under the skin longer than any of us were watching for it. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The unfinished part had the same shape as the word chill Farrow had used a dozen times, easy as spitting. "Can you cut it?" Wyatt asked. 4 days ago, maybe. Pruitt didn't look up. Tonight, I can only make her comfortable and tell you the truth instead of a kindness. Wyatt had heard men choose the kindness over the truth his whole life. He was grateful Pruitt hadn't. Farrow lingered in the doorway, watching a scene he didn't know what to do with, then went to make coffee nobody had asked him for. He didn't apologize. Wyatt hadn't expected him to. Kaya's eyes opened past midnight, clearer than Wyatt expected, not because she'd turned a corner, because there are hours near the end when a body spends its last honest fuel on the mind instead of the fight. Wyatt, I'm here. I know. A ghost of the almost smile from 2 nights before. Every night. Strange thing for a lawman to be good at. He pulled the chair to the bars, same as always, and didn't answer that. Nothing he could say wouldn't have sounded like an apology, and she hadn't asked for one of those either. "The judge," she said. "How far off?" 6 weeks when they brought you in. Past 3 now." He did the arithmetic out loud, steadied his hands to do it. Could be another 3 yet. Won't make it that long. Flat. The way she'd said mistake. The way she'd said the paper is. No edge for a man to catch and argue with. Didn't expect to. Not since the 2nd week. A careful breath, rationed like the water. Wanted you to hear the true telling first. That's all the extra time bought me. Telling. Kaya, don't. I'm not asking anything for me. Her hand found his through the bars, dry and too warm. Told it to you in pieces, 6 nights running. A whole telling at once is too heavy for one sitting. You know the shape of it now. My husband, my father, the paper in the hem. She gathered whatever the fever had left her. That's not what I need tonight. Then tell me what you need. Swear it, not for my sake. I won't be here to collect on a promise. For the next one. Her grip tightened, small, everything she had. Read the lease to the judge, out loud. Say my father's name the way it's written, not the way it's easy to say. Don't let it sit folded in a drawer as evidence in a case that ends when I do. I swear it. Not just to Marsh, whoever's standing in that square, loud enough that Prater's name gets said too. The man who signed it, not the man paying for the grass now. Each sentence cost more than the last. Trewin's not who did this to me. The ones who do this never stand close enough to hear it read back to them. That's how the whole thing keeps working. Wyatt held her hand through the iron and said nothing. There was nothing left to add to a request that complete. You didn't kill me. Before he could carry that thought himself. I want that said too, while I've got breath for it. You arrested a woman on a paper you didn't read. That's a different thing than what you're about to start blaming yourself for. 4 in the morning, alone, in that chair, for years. the almost smile again, fainter now. I've seen the difference. Buried a husband who died from it once already. I should have read it at the crossing. You should have. You didn't. Here we are. No forgiveness in it. No blame either. Just the same flat honesty she'd been spending all week. Wasting my last talking on making you feel better won't fix either fact. So I won't. I'll spend it on the part that still can be. Her eyes drifted somewhere past him, past the bars, past the stone. The particular middle distance Wyatt had watched two other dying men find years apart, right before a room goes quiet in the way it only goes once. "Say his name back to me," she said, "so I know you'll say it right in that square. Your father's name. Say it." Wyatt said it, careful, slow, the way she'd taught him to say hers the first morning at the crossing. Something eased in her face when he got it right. Not relief, completion. A debt paid a moment before she stopped being able to collect on any debt at all. She didn't speak again. Her breathing went shallow, then shallower. A rhythm Wyatt had learned to dread over 9 nights and sat memorizing anyway because it was the last thing of hers he'd get firsthand. Past 3 in the morning, the rhythm changed one final time, quiet as a held breath finally let go, and then it did not change again. Doc Pruitt sat back on his heels, didn't reach for his bag, didn't say the word out loud. Some words don't need saying twice in a lifetime, and Wyatt had already heard this one 18 months back from a battlefield surgeon delivering the same news. Farrow appeared in the doorway, roused by the stillness rather than any sound, and looked at the cot, then at Wyatt's hand still closed around the bars. For once in 9 days, he didn't have an easy word ready. "I want the undertaker sent for at first light," Wyatt said, before Farrow could reach for one anyway. His voice came out steadier than he felt. He sat with her through what was left of the dark, hand still through the bars, holding fingers that had stopped holding back. The lease rode folded against his own chest now, warm from his skin the way it had once been warm from hers. The stone gave up the last of the night's cold near 5, Wyatt still in the chair, when boots sounded on the steps outside. Brisk, unfamiliar, a full week earlier than any boots had business in Llano. "Judge Marsh," Farrow said in the front room, too loud, too fast, "weren't due till..." Circuit moved up. Docket in Mason cleared early. Marsh's voice carried plain down the hall, the voice of a man used to being heard the first time. "Holding a woman on a cattle charge going on 6 weeks now? Where's Ranger Ledbetter? I want his report before I hear the case." Wyatt rose. His leg had gone stiff from the hours of sitting, and for once he didn't reach for the wall. No free hand to spare. The lease pressed flat against his chest, and something in him no longer cared if Marsh saw him limp toward the office at all. He had the paper. He had the sworn word he'd given an hour before sunrise. What he didn't have was any certainty a judge a week early would want it read out loud in a square that had never once said Osgood Prater's name back to him. Marsh did not ask for the report first. He asked for the room. By 7, the land office had no room left to give. Word moved through Llano the way water moves through a dry creek bed. Slow at first, then all at once, until the porch and the street beyond it held more people than the square had seen since the last hanging. Trewin stood near the door, hat in both hands. Vance the clerk had the ledger already open on the counter, a man who guessed what was coming and wanted no part of being blamed for slow paperwork. Marsh sat behind the counter itself, boots on the rail, the look of a judge who'd ridden a week early expecting a simple cattle case and found something else waiting instead. Ranger Ledbetter. Marsh didn't stand. I'm told you've got more than a warrant to read me. I do. Wyatt's voice came out steadier than his leg felt. But it isn't mine to read quiet. She asked for the square to hear it too. She being the deceased. Kaya, Wyatt said. Just the name. The same way he'd first said it at the crossing 10 days and a lifetime ago. She's not here to say it herself. I gave my word I'd say it for her. Marsh studied him a long moment. The stiff leg, the coat worn thin at the fold, where paper had ridden against a man's chest for 2 straight days. Whatever he saw, it was enough. He nodded once toward the open door. The porch had gone quiet enough to hear a wagon wheel 2 streets off. Wyatt unfolded the lease for the last time. No hands left to spare. He read the top grant first. 1861. Full and continuing right to graze the crossing at Badu. He said the name written there, Kaya's father's name, slow, syllable by syllable, the way she taught him the one night he'd gotten it wrong. Nobody on the porch spoke. Somewhere behind him, Farrow's boots went still. Then the addendum, 1876. The bloodless clerk's language, redefining a family's grass as a lease, subject to reassignment, where continued occupancy cannot be demonstrated. He read the name, signed beneath it, plain, loud enough to carry past the porch rail into the street. Osgood Prater, regional agent, 3 days' ride away. A man who had never once seen the water he'd signed out from under her. 14 months before I ever rode to that crossing, Wyatt said, folding nothing back up yet. A man who will never stand in this square wrote his name under a lie and called it paperwork. I arrested the woman standing on her own family's grass because I trusted a warrant more than I trusted my own eyes. She forgave me for that before she died. I've got no plans to forgive myself half so quick. Trewin's hat turned slow in his hands. He said nothing. He'd said his piece already, out at the fence line. A man doesn't repeat a confession twice in 1 week. Marsh took both documents when Wyatt finally passed them across the counter. The old grant, the new theft, stapled together by one dishonest sentence. He read them in silence, the whole square waiting on a judge's face the way a congregation waits on weather. When he looked up, there was no ceremony left in him at all. The 1876 reassignment is void, Marsh said. Voided on the record this morning, in this office. The grazing right at Badu Crossing reverts to the original grant. He set the papers down flat. Reverts to whom, I am obliged to ask, since the man who holds the name on this lease has been dead some 15 years, and his only daughter buried 3 days past. Nobody answered him. No one left standing in that room with a right to answer. Then the land answers to no one, Marsh said, quieter now, which is its own kind of justice and its own kind of shame, both at once. He looked at Wyatt. I'll not fault a ranger for reading a warrant he was handed. I will ask what you intend to do with what you've read since. Every lease signed under the 76 agreement in this county, Wyatt said. I want them pulled and checked, one by one, against whatever the original grants say. however long it takes. That's not a ranger's job. No, Wyatt said. It's mine now anyway. Marsh didn't argue that either. He reached for his pen and began the long, unglamorous work of writing an order into a ledger that would outlast every man in the room to read it. The only kind of justice this particular crime had left to give. Wyatt rode to the crossing alone. The square had emptied by then, and Trewin's 50 head had drifted back to grazing that no longer belonged to any name at all. He carved the letters himself that evening by the last of the light. Her name, her father's beside it, cut deep into a post of cedar with a knife that had never done gentler work. He drove it into the bank a few feet from the water, where the mud still held her cattle's tracks from the morning he'd first seen her standing there, unafraid, waiting for him to speak first. He did not hide the cane this time, not once. He'd carried it the whole ride out, openly across the saddle, where any man passing could see it. Now he set it against the new-cut post, upright, in the open, no longer something to leave behind a door. A ranger who no longer needed to prove he didn't need it. The law doesn't always fail loudly, he thought, the light going gold and low across the hill country. Sometimes it only signs, quietly, and hopes nobody reads it far enough to see whose name is under the lie. She hadn't asked him for more time at the end, only that the next one wouldn't have to die to be believed. If a person had only hours left to spend on being heard and not one more, what would they choose to leave said? And who, after them, would have to be the one to carry it? The herd crossed at first light the next morning, unhurried. Nobody's brand on a single one of them, water breaking gold around their legs the way it had broken around hers. The cane stood open against the post at the water's edge. Her name held steady in the cedar beside her father's, cut deep enough to outlast them both. Nothing else moved at the crossing but the river, going on the way it always had, indifferent to what had been signed, and to who, at last, had finally read it out loud.